Well, let me introduce our three panelists. As I say, I think all of you know them. Dan Berger is a graduate of Oberlin College. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. He's been with the Sun since 1967. He served as its London bureau chief in the late 1960s, and he's been an editorial writer since the early 70s. He's written on almost every conceivable topic, but his specialty really has been foreign affairs. And most of the things you'll read now on foreign affairs will be the product of Dan's analysis. Stephen David has been a professor at Johns Hopkins University since 1981. He's a graduate. His PhD is from Harvard, although he graduated from Union College and then master's degree at Stanford before that, before a master's and PhD at Harvard. He's the author of 3 books, I believe, and the author of numerous articles and monographs. He's, for a long time, been the senior international relations specialist at the Homewood campus. Joseph Sterne is known to all of you from his writings for The Sun. He was, from 1972 to 97, the editor of the editorial page of the Baltimore Sun, a very distinguished editorial page. Joe, before that, had served as bureau chief in London and in Bonn. He's been at the Sun, was at the Sun before retirement for, I think, 4.5 decades. Joe looks very youthful, and you wouldn't believe it was that long. And he even has a more dashing appearance tonight than usual, which I promised not to comment on, but I couldn't resist. He's presently with Johns Hopkins as a senior fellow at their Policy Studies Institute. We appreciate so much that he chaired our Baltimore Sun foreign policy panel for 20 years, which was just absolutely wonderful. He's been a supporter of the council since before it was founded, and he presently serves on our board of trustees. So we're always delighted to welcome Joe. With that said, let me present to you our very, very distinguished panel.
Well, I think we decided I go first. I'm Dan Berger. The premise of my remarks is that, to my observation, there are 2 political parties in this country. They are the presidential party and the congressional party. The presidential party is globalist, it's free trader, it's somewhat interventionist. It finds the UN a useful arena and the IMF and the World Bank indispensable tools for leveraging American influence in the world. It favors foreign aid as a tool in the president's hands to achieve policy objectives. It views any country from several perspectives, which would include human rights, economic power, military power, common interest or the lack of it, so it is not morally consistent. The congressional party is suspicious of foreigners and of the administration, and sometimes confuses the two. It has certain isolationist tendencies. I wouldn't call it isolationist, but it has those tendencies. It's hostile to international agencies. It views foreign aid as money down a rat hole of graft. It will see any country through a single issue lens, but from country to country, it's not the same lens, and therefore, it is also, though moralistic, not morally consistent. It often legislates to constrain the president's freedom of action and may even demonize the president of the opposite party. Some, but not all. Reagan and Clinton both suffered that. What it's obstructionist about may vary, whether it's the majority is conservative Republican or liberal Democrat, but they both do it. My point is that both Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush are in the presidential party, and they have more in common with each other, in my view, than either has with Senator Helms. Just to ram that home, in 1991, in the very moving debate and vote on whether President Bush should send troops to Saudi Arabia, Senator Gore was one of just 10 Democrats who voted in favor of his doing so. Now, Mr. Bush could say anything he wants about the Kosovo action last year. All his party in Congress were against it. They said they supported the troops, but they were against the decision. And they certainly were against the president who made the decision. 31 of those have launched a lawsuit that just yesterday or the day before was finally rejected in the Supreme Court, challenging Clinton's right to have done it. But Bush's webpage puts it on the record that he favored that bombing. And not only did he favor it, or he now says he favored it, but he opposed the pledge not to send ground troops. He thought that limited freedom of action or told too much to the opposition. So that's my point about them. They're both presidential. In the presidential party, there's a spectrum, and they're on opposite ends of it, rhetorically. And I'm going to try to show that, but also suggest that their rhetoric exaggerates their policy differences. And I don't think, they're not the same. It does make a difference. But they're not as far apart as they would make out. Now, neither is talking about foreign policy so far. And there was a poll I saw a couple of weeks ago that said 6% of voters think they're not talking about foreign policy enough. 6%. The other 94% are satisfied, and that's why they're not doing it. Mr. Bush assigns Dick Cheney to attack Clinton-Gore record on security, but mostly on military matters, not foreign policy as foreign policy. I think that Bush took it for granted that he was going to win this election, but that his one weakness was that he was perceived as inexperienced or weak on foreign affairs. And so he visibly surrounded himself with experts and took their advice and called the photographers in to show him receiving advice from a whole series of genuine experts, all of whom had important positions in his father's administration. And the most important of these is Cheney. But the most important advisor in day-to-day and practical terms is Condoleezza Rice. I'll tell you a little about her. Most of you know her, but who she is, some may not. She joined the Bush administration as a staff member of the National Security Council. That's usually a very invisible post. But she got the spotlight for being newsworthy and breaking stereotypes. She was female, young, pretty, African-American, brilliant, a published scholar on Eastern European military affairs, a Cold War hawk, and not shy. And after the administration went out of office in 1993, she became provost of Stanford University, its second-ranking officer, its highest academic and financial officer. She was 38 years old. She has just resigned that office while remaining on the faculty. You'll recall her speech at the Republican National Convention. It was a very prominent primetime speech. And she ended on a semi-isolationist note for think of who was there in the hall, saying that the U.S. would not be the world's policeman. And then she smiled and waited for applause. And that was her. She knew that was the message they wanted. Other people, and she calls her group of advisors the Vulcans, which is a private joke of hers, and it has to do with roots in Birmingham and some statue there, and I don't know much about that. But one of the Vulcans, they are people whose names you may remember, like Richard Pearl, Richard Armitage, Robert Zellick. The one second most important to her is Paul Wolfowitz. He's a Far Eastern expert. He was Assistant Secretary of State and Ambassador to Indonesia in the Reagan administration. He was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Bush administration. And since then, he has been dean of a different Johns Hopkins school, the School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, in Washington. And I have met people at SAIS who pray for a Gore victory because they think Dean Wolfowitz is wonderful for the institution and they don't want him to leave. A Washington Post reporter speculated, you don't have to believe this, he put it in gossipy terms, that Condoleezza Rice would be National Security Advisor in the Bush administration and Paul Wolfowitz would be director of the CIA. And everyone speaks of Colin Powell as Secretary of State, so much so that I do not take it for granted, but he'll be in some position. And if that isn't the lineup, don't blame me, blame the Washington Post. Now, I think that Gore believes that he starts out with the advantage in foreign policy, that everyone knows it, and he doesn't have to talk about it. He also wants it established that as he is Clinton's principal advisor on foreign policy, he'd have us believe, it's not all that necessary that we think about who's advising him. But someone does, and so I thought to prepare for this speech, I ought to look it up. And the first thing I found, and it's helped me, the first thing that I came up on the database was this from the New York Times of August 10th of this year. Correction. A picture caption yesterday with a front page article about the process of choosing Al Gore's running mate misspelled the surname of Mr. Gore's foreign policy advisor. He is Leon Firth, F-U-E-R-T-H, not Firth, F-U-R-T-H. Now, the New York Times is incapable of misspelling Condoleezza Rice. But there's an E after the U in Leon Firth. Who knew? This perfect civil servant, I'll tell you about him a little bit. I found out he's 61 years old, government official all his life, all his career. He served 12 years in the Foreign Service, most of those in Washington. He was on the staff of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in 1980 when a new young member asked for a tutorial on nuclear arms control issues. Not a briefing, a tutorial. And a year later, Al Gore was the House's acknowledged nerd on arms control. He knew everything. And he and Firth actually came to his office once a week. They'd lock the door, and his staff, for the better part of a year, didn't know who that man was. When Gore went to the Senate, Firth joined his staff. And after the 1992 election, there was a Transition Committee subcommittee of 3 people to screen national security appointments. He was one of the 3. Since then, he's been on the staff of the National Security Council with the title of the Vice President's National Security Advisor. He's in the loop on everything. When Gore makes a trip, he arranges it. When Gore is a co-chairman with a foreign head of government of a bilateral commission, and they've got 5 of them, Firth is the U.S. staff chief. What his contributions are to discussions, we don't know. He's not like these people who advised Bush. He doesn't publish. He is Al Gore's personal trainer in foreign policy and has been for 20 years. And he is a far closer advisor to Gore than Condoleezza Rice is to Bush. He's just known him much longer and seen him more often. Everyone assumes he would succeed Sandy Berger, no relation, as National Security Advisor. There would be other personnel changes. When Secretary Albright testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week, there was a tender note, particularly in her byplay with Senator Helms, that this was her last such visit. I don't know who would be her successor in the Gore administration, but I do think that the new people would be moving up in government. I think there would be continuity. Now, although they haven't debated foreign policy yet, for people who just insist on knowing something, they post their views on the web, on their websites. So I printed them out and read them and prepared. Bush's, in my printer, took 2 pages. It has no paragraphs or even very few complete sentences. It has... It has 22 bullet points, and it reads like a staff paper he would be willing to read. Gore's reads like an article in Foreign Affairs Quarterly, or maybe 3, that he would be willing to write. It's full of long paragraphs on every possible subject, except one. There's a 4-letter word, Cuba. It's not in it. But everything else, including many you didn't think were foreign policy issues. And then 13 of these pages just list his accomplishments, because anything the Clinton administration... Gore and Bush agree on one thing, that anything the Clinton administration did is Gore's fault or credit. Bush is spare and sounds kind of harsh on China and Russia. He calls for a warming with India on a basis that is already taking place. He wants to reestablish weapons inspections in Iraq, keep sanctions on Cuba until Cuba has freedom. He wants to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem right now. He would never place U.S. troops under UN command. He would pay dues to the UN only if its bureaucracy is or when its bureaucracy is reformed. And he would want more transparency at the IMF and World Bank. Now that broadly does 2 things. It looks back at the Cold War, not in nostalgia, but as a frame of reference for bearings. And while I don't think that's adequate, I also don't think it's altogether wrong. You don't know where you're going, but you know where you've been. And I notice that one other world statesman does that. And it's very visible and important that he does that, and that's Vladimir Putin. And I think to deal with Putin, to understand him, you need a little of that. The other thing this does is cater to the congressional party and with these standoffish ideas about the rest of the world. I take this with a grain of salt. I don't believe it all. I think that he is going to want more wiggle room, more flexibility than he's giving himself. And I will notice that while there's one important Republican constituency that wants what he says about Cuba, there's another important Republican constituency or 2 that wants more flexibility on Cuba. Gore's policy has a slogan to let you think he has a concept and a grand design. The slogan is forward engagement. Form partnerships, solve global problems, deepen alliances, develop constructive relationships with former enemies, and crime and disease and ecological disruption are included as foreign policy issues, that they may be threats to national security. Now, this is very opposite in rhetoric. It's not so opposite in substance. One example, take China. Bush would redefine relations with Beijing, quote, as one of competitors, not strategic partners, unquote. Gore says the U.S. interest is not served by those who would treat China as an enemy. He would, quote, build cooperation where we can and deal with differences as we must, unquote, encouraging China to be strong, prosperous, and open. Now, that sounds very different. They both favor a one China policy, and Beijing is that one China. They both favor the protections that are in place for Taiwan. They both favor permanent normal trading relations with China that's been enacted and getting China in the World Trade Organization, and they both don't want to talk about that. So they're not poles apart. They only say they are. A big part of the Bush campaign is that Clinton and Gore have underfunded the military while extending its responsibilities too far. But Gore actually says exactly the same things Bush does about spending for a stronger and more flexible military. And they both say not how much and no specifics. So which would do more, whether they're the same or different. You can't tell from what they say. Condoleezza Rice attacks the administration's interventionism. She means military. Gore calls for forward engagement on everything. He means diplomatic. They're not as far apart as they say. As from my guess as to what they think would be a success, how they'd want to leave a mark on history, I think Gore would want to achieve something permanent in global environmental protection and in arms control. And I think Bush would measure success in getting more countries that are hostile to us to be friendly to us, as in the Cold War success. I think the biggest hurdle for each would be Congress, and I think it's not the subject of this meeting, but one of the big changes in foreign policy is going to depend on who controls the House and the Senate. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephen David, and I'm also going to discuss the differences between Bush and Gore on foreign policy. And some of the themes I'll touch upon will be reminiscent of Mr. Berger's talk, so I hope I won't unduly bore you. First, before discussing the differences between the two, let me issue three qualifications, three caveats. Foreign policy usually is not a major issue in presidential elections. And this is certainly no exception. I mean, there are some exceptions. The Vietnam War is ongoing. There's a major threat of some kind of conflict. But for the most part, foreign policy plays a subsidiary role in how we choose our president. And again, this election, as Mr. Berger alluded to, certainly exemplifies that. Most people are not going to vote, I think, for either Bush or Gore based on foreign policy. Secondly, the positions that Bush and Gore hold on foreign policy aren't all that distinct. I'm going to go over some of the differences in a minute, but they don't disagree on the fundamentals dealing with foreign policy. Both have very professional staffs. Both have advisors who are reasonable people. I mean, you don't have a kind of Pat Buchanan or Ralph Nader approach to the world where someone's going to go off and do something totally crazy. Consistency, following in the path that the Clinton administration has forged, seems to be much more the order of the day. It's also important to realize that with the Cold War over, this is sort of the third qualification, it's hard to come to distinct positions on foreign policy. I mean, during the Cold War, for all its horrible aspects, in terms of foreign policy, it imposed a kind of clarity on issues, at least where you stood. I mean, either on one side you had people who saw the Soviet Union as a major threat. One had to deal with it, contain it, build up the military to cope with it, or perhaps you were more accommodating to the Soviet threat, felt we should do more negotiation, treaties, whatever. But virtually every major foreign policy decision, every major and minor military intervention that was undertaken during the Cold War had to do with the Soviet threat. Now the Soviet Union did this horrible thing to us. It collapsed, it disappeared, it dissolved. And so too was our foreign policy rudder. Now the issues about humanitarian intervention, Hutus versus Tutsis, what do you do about Milosevic, are much more in gray areas. It's hard to know who the interventionists are, who the isolationists are, what left means, what right wing means in foreign policy. It's all a muddle. So when you put all this together, drawing sharp distinctions between Bush and Gore on the issue of foreign policy is a very difficult and in some ways even a forced exercise. But nevertheless, let me identify three issues where I've at least discerned differences, at least in rhetoric, if not in what they will do once they become president. The first and maybe most important of these is the whole issue of ballistic missile defense. Now, as many of you probably realize, the United States today has no defense against ballistic missiles. If some crazy Russian colonel with one vodka too many and a failed love affair is sitting in a silo somewhere and decides to end it all and take out Baltimore with him and sends a missile heading our way, there's nothing we could do except get the hell out of the city as quickly as we can. And if you know what the JFX is like on a normal rush hour, you can imagine what it's like with a 20-minute warning. So there is this concern that, hey, we should be able to do something about a ballistic missile threat, especially since today the threat is not many thousands of warheads from the Soviet Union, which most reasonable people agreed could not be successfully defeated, but a handful of warheads from either an accident or some rogue nation like Iraq or North Korea or France sometimes when they're on a bad day. So what do we do about this threat from a ballistic missile attack? Well, both Bush and Gore agree we should have a defense against ballistic missiles. And again, this is a major change from the past because we don't have that today. Whether or not it's a good idea is really a subject for another talk. Where they differ is that Gore is much more modest in the kind of defense that he would like the United States to undertake. Without getting into all the technical details, he wants essentially a land-based defense where the missiles are based on the land, intercept the warheads as they re-enter the atmosphere, and provide a very light defense of the American homeland. Such a defense would require a modification of the anti-ballistic missile treaty we had with the Soviet Union, we now have with Russia, but it's perhaps doable within the arms-controlled diplomatic framework. Bush has argued for something quite different. He wants a reprise almost of Reagan's Star Wars, a much more sophisticated, multi-layered, space-detected defense that he says would be much more effective, would also probably be a lot more costly, but he says would do the job in a way that Gore's defense would not. The problem is that while it might be a more effective defense, it's much more likely to get us into trouble with our allies who oppose us doing this, with the Russians who have said they don't want any American defense because they're concerned it's going to render their nuclear warheads impotent, and the Chinese who argue that if you make such a defense, the Chinese are going to respond by a major escalation in weapons to saturate that defense. So here is, again, a very specific but clear example of a difference between Bush and Gore. And it's likely to come to the fore quickly after one man or the other is elected. A second difference has to do with the whole issue of humanitarian intervention. Most of the concerns about whether we are going to intervene, by we I mean the United States, in the world with military force, are not interventions designed to protect American security or even economic well-being, but to save the lives of hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of innocent people. But there's a real debate about this. Should the United States send its own soldiers to far-off lands simply to protect the innocent lives of others? I mean, it's not a rhetorical question. Should Americans die when vital security and economic interests of the United States are not at stake? And reasonable people disagree. Those who say, as Bush does, that perhaps we should not, although on the Yugoslav issue he seems to at least be wavering, make the case that humanitarian interventions often don't work, that these are age-old feuds, that putting troops in the middle of them is simply putting a Band-Aid over a gaping wound, that it is difficult to explain to the parents of some young man or woman who was killed in a far-off land why that happened when the hatreds fester and continue, that it's likely to be very, very expensive and drain the American military of the strength it needs when and if a true security threat emerges later. Those who seem to be more for humanitarian interventions, and Gore seems to be more favorably disposed to this, argue that it is diminishing to the United States to turn a blind eye when actions that shock the conscience of mankind occur and we do nothing about it. That the Rwandan genocide, in which 800,000 people were killed, some argue could have been stopped with a very limited intervention at very limited cost, and yet the United States and the rest of the world stood around and did nothing. And one can't avoid echoes of the Holocaust when we think of these things. How far should we intervene? Where should we intervene? How do we avoid seeming to be hypocritical? I mean, no one's talking about intervention in the Sudan, where far more people were killed than are being killed in the Balkans. I mean, these are all very difficult questions. But on this general issue, my guess is that a Gore administration would be more likely to get involved in these kinds of fights than would a Bush administration. Finally, there seems to be a difference over the whole question of multilateralism versus unilateralism. I mean, this is a fancy way of terming an issue whereby the Bush people feel United States, the preeminent power, if we've got a problem, we should be able to handle it pretty much by ourselves and not have to depend on others. And most of all, there is this very strong suspicion of the United Nations as this kind of bloated institution that doesn't do much good, costs a lot of money, is basically a tool of third world despots, and we're better off without it or doing a minimum with it. Moreover, in terms of intervening or getting involved in issues of the world, you get a sense that the Bush administration really sees the U.S. as the leader and basically is saying either it's my way or the highway. My sense is that a Gore administration would be much more friendly to the United Nations, would be more ally-friendly as well, try and do things in a multilateral framework, work with our NATO allies, work with other allies, and not get involved unless there is a consensus to do so by other countries in the world. And here again, reasonable people can disagree as to what the right path to follow. I mean, doing things on your own risks alienating our friends and potential adversaries. Waiting for a consensus to develop mitigates our leadership role. And some of our allies are very, very timid about doing things. I doubt very much that the Kosovo operation or even the Persian Gulf War would have occurred without strong American leadership. So again, reasonable people can disagree, but my sense is the tone of a Bush administration, much more unilateral, we're going to do it our own way. Gore administration, much more consulting. In the end, however, I think when people make their mind up versus Bush versus Gore, especially the few undecideds that are left, the subtle and intangible issue of character is going to be most important. It's not how they feel about this or that, or ballistic missile defense or intervention. What I think people reasonably are going to do when they watch the debates tonight and try and assess the presidential candidates is get a sense of what man do we want in the White House when something unexpected happens. If a Cuban Missile Crisis erupts, if some terrorist does some horrible biological weapons attack, if the oil fields are ablaze in Saudi Arabia, if, as what seems to be happening, the Middle East crisis spirals out of control, who do we want there? Which person with which advisors do we feel has the character, the intelligence, the discipline, the knowledge to do the right kind of thing? to act as John Kennedy did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And obviously here people will disagree, but it's on these intangibles that I think the foreign policy issue will be decided. Thank you.
My name is Joe Stern. I am not here to sell Hathaway shirts. I think all of us tonight should pause for a moment and give thanks to the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, because OPEC, more than any other politicians or pundits that you'll be hearing, has brought an element of reality to this campaign. And the element of reality is oil. And it's amazing to me to read the speeches of Bush and Gore and to know that before the price rise, not one word would be raised on this issue of any importance. It's been happily ignored now for several reasons. For one thing, we know that the great boom of the 90s was fueled by the information superhighway. We're told this every single day. But actually, another very important contributing factor to the boom of the 90s was the very, very low price of oil, which amounted to a huge tax cut for the American people, which fueled the economy and poured in great profits to the Treasury and enabled the Clinton administration to be able to brag about getting rid of deficits and going into surplus. It's too bad that this issue was not raised until our friends in OPEC did it for us. It comes down to what my colleagues were talking about, and that is the use of forces. All of the debate that we're here has to do with intervention on behalf of humanitarian causes. And we have intervened on a few occasions. We have selected these occasions very carefully so that they're small and they're reasonable and they're containable, and primarily they can be pulled off without any American casualties, because since the Vietnam War, we have not had any government or any leading politician who would dare to talk about interventions that would actually cause major casualties. Now, our president went to Rwanda and said, gee, we should have engaged in Rwanda, and maybe we could have headed off a horrible genocide. And that's become kind of the accepted truth. But the fact is that Rwanda is a very tiny little country which happens to be beating the hell out of a very large country called the Congo. And I'm sure that in the quarters of the administration that do not engage in public rhetoric, there were people who realized that getting into the middle of Central Africa could create the kind of casualties for a cause that the American people would not support. So that gets us to the question, what would the American people support? Well, there's one thing the American people will support, and that is they'll go to war to drive their automobiles. You can be sure of it. And the only major intervention we've had in recent years has been to maintain the supply of oil. We went into Kuwait not to back up some little postage stamp emirate over there. We went there to make sure that we could guarantee the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf in infinite. Now, if we're talking about security, what is the one issue that would get an American intervention of rather large forces? It's my feeling that it would be a major cutoff of oil by some states in the world. And at that point, you can be sure that the United States would take action, whatever is required to maintain the flow of oil until we get to the point that Vice President Gore mentions of alternative fuels. But it's not going to happen very soon. One of the things that amuses me is that in the Clinton years, and they have to be the Clinton-Gore years, the icon of the 1990s was the SUV. And we allowed ourselves to throw away all the lessons we learned in the early 70s by insisting on fuel efficiency. And this administration just went along with the flow because everybody was rich and fat and happy, and they allowed SUVs to be classified as trucks rather than cars. So there was no fuel efficiency imposed upon them. So let's welcome our friends from OPEC for focusing some attention on these unspoken issues that are really underlying major problems of American policy. There's a couple other things. Professor David mentioned that foreign policy does not figure very much in American presidential campaigns, and that's true, but let's remember Quemoy and Matsu, 1960. John F. Kennedy, the supreme hawk, was all for taking action to protect Quemoy and Matsu against the bloody Chinese. And it was that noted pacifist Richard Nixon who took the Mod Review that night. And then let's go ahead to 1976, when President Ford declared that Poland was free of the Soviet yoke. He really meant that the Polish spirit was free of the Soviet yoke, and I've always had great sympathy for Gerald Ford since then because I think I know what he was talking about. Now, my colleagues have mentioned the business of Mr. Gore's famous forward engagement policy. Well, I came across a quote from Vice President Gore that I'd like you to read and count with me the conditions he set in this sentence. He said, in the global age, we must be prepared to engage in regional conflicts selectively, number one, where the stability of a region important to our national security is at stake, two, where we can assure ourselves that nothing short of military engagement can secure our national interests, number three, where we are certain that the use of military forces can succeed in doing so, number four, where we have allies willing to help and share in the burden, number five, and where the cost is proportionate to the object to be gained, number six. Well, I would say that the caveats in that supposed interventionist statement are so huge that he and Condoleezza Rice can dance the waltz together, as she says, we're no 911. So I agree with my colleagues totally that anybody who really is interested in foreign affairs knows that the differences between these two men are very, very incremental. I think that's actually a very good thing for our country. I think America bestrides the earth as such a colossus, with the greatest military force that's ever been seen in the history of the world, with a force relative to its adversaries is greater than anything has ever been seen in the history of the world, that it's a good thing that we have incremental foreign policy candidates in this election, because the mainstream of U.S. policy is so important to us and to the rest of the world that sudden veerings to one side or the other could be very disruptive to the world. Thank you.
Before we open the floor to questions, we're asking our panelists to either question one another or comment as they see fit upon an aspect of their colleagues' presentations.
I'd like to ask Professor David a question, if I might. I'd like to I'd like his opinion on this business of American willingness to take casualties and how this does affect foreign policy.
Well, the question has to deal with casualties and American willingness in foreign policy. I don't think our willingness or unwillingness to take casualties is crippling in foreign policy in most respects. I think the United States is willing to take casualties when it feels its national or economic interests are at stake.
Yeah.
I remember before the Persian Gulf War, we expected many thousands of casualties, and yet public opinion was generally in favor of it. During Vietnam, we absorbed tens of thousands of dead. Where I think we are very unwilling to accept casualties are in humanitarian interventions, where we're going into a place to help the people, as we did in Somalia, find out it's more complicated than that, and then as soon as double-digit casualties emerge, we're going to take off. So where it will affect us, in my view, is on these humanitarian issues. Mm-hmm. But if and when our national security is threatened, I don't think the casualty issue will be that crippling.
I just want to apologize to the audience. I agree with everything both my colleagues said, and I feel I'm letting you down in that respect.
Well, I'd like to hear from the audience. They're very patient, so.
Two questions. One, comment on their positions with respect to NATO expansion, and who in the Clinton administration is admired so much by Mr. Gore that he would keep them on.
I think one they could keep on would be Secretary Cohen, Republican senator, well respected by both sides.
Dennis Ross, who is our chief Middle East negotiator, had this position under the elder President Bush, and obviously the Republican administration, has served well under Clinton, and my guess might be continued under a younger Bush.
And on NATO expansion? Any differences?
Again, I'm not sure as to how they would respond to that. Condoleezza Rice is an expert in that area, so she would do so in an informed way, but whether they would accelerate it or not, I don't know.
How are the Bush-Gore people responding to the crisis in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis of the last 5 days, or if they're not, how do you think they will or would?
My sense is the Gore support of Israel is almost a more emotional, long-standing one. Bush's support of Israel is, certainly in his rhetoric, even stronger than Clinton's, who's a very strong supporter of Israel. He's very upfront, or he tries to make the point, especially before Jewish groups, that he won't push around Israel, he won't force them to do this and that. As you heard, he's going to move the embassy right away. When confronted with the realities and complexities of the Middle East, though, I suspect both would behave with some caution.
Yeah, I think usually the out party is for moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem as quickly as possible. When they become the in party, they find ways to avoid that. And I guess Mr. Bush must regret his comment of a few months ago where he said how proud he was to be touring the West Bank with R.L. Sterne, that great defender of freedom and a courageous man.
What do you think the candidates would recommend with respect to the price of the euro?
I think they'd both go to Dr. Greenspan and say, Alan, what should we do?
That might be true, but I think it's a little bit dicier than that. I think that the United States has an interest in making sure that the euro experiment doesn't fall into tatters. And I think that at the appropriate times you'll see the United States willing to intervene in the capital markets as it did just a week ago, and for good cause and good reason to do so. It's also true that while we like to say we've got a strong dollar, the fact that we have a strong dollar, of course, hurts our exports and increases our trade deficit. which is going to into the stratosphere as it is because of the oil situation.
Has the problem of Mr. Indek, Ambassador Indek, had any impact on our foreign affairs, our relations with India, and what would the candidates, Israel, I'm sorry, and what would the candidates' positions be?
I have no inside information on this. I think it couldn't help but hurt, though. I mean, Indik is ambassador to Israel in large part because he's trusted by Ehud Barak, and to a certain degree by Yasser Arafat as well. He's a key person. To take this person out of the loop, to deny him access to classified information, which is virtually all the information that an ambassador would need, is crippling us at a horrible time. And I have to confess, I don't really understand this. I mean, this strikes me as security people going wild in the State Department. Maybe it's echoes of the Wenho Lee case. I'm not sure. But it seems to be the United States shooting itself in the foot for what seems to be minor or trivial violations.
Well, the question was simply on the question of AIDS, would the change of administration matter? Or does it matter which candidate gets elected with respect to the question of AIDS, especially in Africa?
Rhetorically, Gore would say that AIDS in Africa is a threat to U.S. national security, and he could make people understand what he means and seem to be more willing to spend money, if he can get it from Congress, to help reduce it. Whether the actual activity and funding would differ very much between the two, I'm not so sure. But Gore probably sounds more interested in the problem.
If I may, with respect to that question, of course, Mr. Gore made a major speech at the UN on that subject alone, and has emphasized Africa. And Mr. Bush has emphasized that in his priorities in the world, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America were the areas that he would concentrate on. The question related to it, is there any significance to be read into the difference of geographic emphases between the two candidates?
African American support for the Democratic Party is greater than it is for the Republican Party, and let's be honest about that. And that Vice President Gore has a constituency of interest there that is somewhat greater than Governor Bush's constituency of interest. However, I think Governor Bush has shown in Texas on a number of issues that he is a very open man, a man who is really not in any sense of the word a racist. And I would think that when he's confronted with real problems, if he should become president, he would probably approach issues such as AIDS in Africa and drug peddling in Latin America with somewhat the same approach as Vice President Gore. Gets back to our feeling that these are incremental differences between these two candidates, and that the central direction of American policy will probably continue as it is.
Any difference between the two candidates with respect to releasing Mr. Pollard?
I think the great objection to releasing Mr. Pollard comes from the CIA, and maybe to some extent from defense. And that argument, whatever it is, and I don't think we know exactly what it is, would be the same with either man.
The stand of both candidates on foreign arms sales.
This is a very complicated question because it comes down to the economic viability of our armaments industry. I think the administration, every administration we have had, certainly since the end of World War II, has considered arms sales an economic asset. and something that can be used as a diplomatic tool of leverage in sending arms abroad. I haven't detected anything specific about these two candidates. Maybe my colleagues have.
Well, the United States is the world's leading supplier of weapons by far. And in a way, I don't think we have to apologize for that. And not just because the brunch was from Lockheed and Grumman and the others. It's not so much how much we sell, but who we sell to. Countries have legitimate needs for defense. We're trying to encourage countries not to develop nuclear weapons. If one way they can provide for their defense is conventionally, and that convinces them not to go nuclear, I mean, so much the better. So my guess is there isn't a real difference between Gore and Bush on this issue.
The question was, why talk about the absurdity of Star Wars?
You've given good argument for not doing it. I think that that Gore has allowed himself more wiggle room to get out of it after the election than Bush has. But I think Bush might also be tempted. I don't know how he would. It's a very big budget issue, and it would impinge on what Bush wants to do in other military expenditures, which is one reason he might want to get out of it.
But also, in fairness to Bush, technology has changed since the time Star Wars was developed. I'm not speaking as a proponent of ballistic missile defense necessarily, but it's not as settled an issue as you make it seem. There are a lot of responsible physicists out there who believe you can develop an effective defense against a small number of incoming warheads, whether it be Star Wars or intercepting the ballistic missiles soon after they launch. I mean, there are a number of interesting ideas out there, and given the catastrophe that would happen if a ballistic missile hit a United States city, we want to be careful about guarding against that.
The basic question was, would the candidates differ on the question of population control? Right. Would they have different policies on the problem of the population of the world, the exploding population?
I think Governor Bush is probably somewhat a prisoner of his party. His party has opposed the use of federal funds to encourage population control in many parts of the world, so that probably there would be some difference of emphasis there.
I think the real problem would be that many Republicans oppose helping agencies who also include abortion as part of the population control package, and those agencies would be crippled.
That's right.
I hope you've all enjoyed this evening. I think it's been a marvelous exercise in objectivity and as well as good humor, and it's been extraordinarily helpful indeed.